Today, I'm going to take this hunk of meat and turn it into 3 different dishes. I'll be making a breakfast pork egg toast, a braised pork sandwich, and Chinese barbecue pork buns or char siu baos. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really know what type of cut this pork is. I think it's some kind of loin, but I want to be able to go to the grocery store, take the cheapest thing I can find, and make really solid meals out of it. So, let's get started. I'm going to be doing a slow cook method, but I'm going to be using my Instant Pot to cook it in a fraction of the time. This will give me a tender, moist pork to work with. I noticed that this piece has a decent amount of fat on top, and I could get rid of it completely, but I want some of that flavor to go into my dish. Basically, I want to maximize the surface area for my spice rub, so the first thing I'm going to do is score it. Some people like to pierce it with the tip of a knife, but I don't think that there's much of a difference for what I'm doing. I'll make a cross pattern and then rub it generously with pepper, salt, and Cajun seasoning, making sure to get all 6 sides covered. Afterwards, you should get something like this. I don't think there's a wrong way to do this, so as long as you're sprinkling everywhere, it should turn out pretty good. I'm going to put this in a bowl to hang out, and I should let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes to let the flavors penetrate, but the reason that I didn't is because I forgot. So in the meantime, I'm going to get the marinade ready. I have a marinade that I froze a while back while making ribs, but you can make a simple marinade from 2 cups of barbecue sauce, a half cup of brown sugar, and a 1/3 cup of apple cider vinegar. I'm going to marinate this for 30 minutes to 1 hour, and this can easily be done the day before. So with the Instant Pot, the general consensus is that it can cook a recipe in 1/3 of the time it would take to cook on the stovetop. So you divide the time by 3. If a recipe says 3 hours, you'd cook it for only 1 hour in the Instant Pot, and if it says 1 hour, you'd cook it for 20 minutes. So I'll put the pork inside the pot, pour the remaining marinade on top, and cook on high pressure for 1 hour. When it's done, I'll release the steam, open it up, and check it out. When taking it out of the pot, I learned the hard way that it's super tender and was literally breaking apart, so I transferred it to a cutting board in 2 sections. When carving, I noticed that this piece of meat has a drier, more lean section, which is probably the loin, and a super juicy, darker section. These juicy pieces I could easily just eat by themselves right then and there, but if I got the leaner piece, I'd want more flavor infused into it. Because an Instant Pot works by cooking under pressure, not a lot of liquid evaporates when cooking. My marinade had too much moisture, and it tasted really watered down, so I decided to boil it down with the sauté function for about 10 minutes to concentrate the flavor. And once it was more viscous, I poured that over those lean pieces so that they could bathe and infuse. You don't need to let this sit overnight, but I started cooking pretty late, so I decided to call it for the day. We now have the completed pork that we're going to use for our dishes. Let's start it out with a simple breakfast. Literally just toast a piece of bread, spread some mayo, then add my heated pork. I fried up an egg and added that, and lastly I chopped up some tomatoes and sprinkled those on top. This was a super quick, simple breakfast that was way nicer than my normal bowl of cereal. Adding the tomatoes was a little bit more work, but it actually added a freshness to the dish, and the acidity helped balance out the rest of the heavier ingredients. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this. Next up is the sandwich. So I got my pork, bread, lettuce, tomato, pickled radish, and mayo. I think for a great sandwich, it takes a mixture and balance of all of these different colors, textures, and flavors to make it not only more visually appealing, but it also adds much more depth. In a previous video, I made a cursed pizza with mango and kimchi and went over balancing these 5 different flavor profiles to elevate your meal. This is a similar concept, but if you want to check that video out, I'll put a card. I am a huge fan of buttered and grilled bread, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Next, I'll reheat the pork on the pan while I start building the sandwich. I'm gonna use light mayo on each side, top it with lettuce. I like to put sauce between the ingredients so that it holds together and doesn't fall apart when you bite into it. I'll put on the tomatoes and season them with salt and pepper, and you might think that this is like a troublesome step, but salt and pepper on the tomato really makes a huge difference, so you gotta trust me on this one. I'll put the pickled radish on the other side and place my pork on top. I would have liked to use spicy mayo here, but I didn't have any, so I settled with garlic aioli. Put it together, cut on the diagonal, and take a look. Not bad. I'm really glad that I decided to reduce down those liquids and infuse the drier parts of the pork overnight. It definitely helped make the pork more juicy and flavorful. The grilled bread really adds a nice complementing butter taste and adds a texture contrast too. I feel that for sandwiches, the bread itself can make it or break it. And I think it's really slept on because it's relatively cheaper than all the other ingredients. But the thing is that the bread surrounds every other ingredient, so with each bite you're gonna taste it. So if you don't like the bread or aren't really fond of it, you're gonna have a bad time. I normally don't like that school sandwich bread that much, so that's why I'm using an Asian milk bread, but even if I compare it to like a baguette or ciabatta sandwich, even visually it just makes a huge difference. For the barbecue pork buns, we're essentially making a filling by combining pork with a gravy, and then we're using dough to wrap it all up. Let's start with the dough. To a bowl, I'm adding 200 grams of bread flour, half a teaspoon of salt, and 1.5 tablespoons of sugar. In a separate cup, I'll dissolve 1 teaspoon of yeast into 83 grams of warm milk. Then I'm gonna pour it into the dry ingredients with 2 eggs and mix it together for about 5 minutes. At this stage, it's going to look super liquidy, so I added 3 tablespoons of flour and mixed it again until it became a dough. After about another 5 minutes, I did a window test, which is basically taking the dough and stretching it between my fingers. If the dough lets light through like a window without breaking apart, the gluten is developed enough to move on to the next step, which is adding the 2 tablespoons of butter and mixing that until the butter is fully incorporated. I'm doing one final window test here to make sure that the dough still isn't breaking before forming it into a ball, covering it, and letting it rest in a warm place until it's doubled in size. This could take about 1 to 2 hours. While I'm waiting for the dough to proof, I'll get the filling ready. I'll chop the pork into 1 centimeter cubes, then fry up 1/4 of an onion in 1/4 cup of oil until golden brown. This can take a tiny bit of time, so while waiting for those onions, I can prep the ingredients for the gravy. In a cup, I'll add 150 grams of water, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1/4 teaspoon of white pepper powder, half a teaspoon of 5 spice powder, 3/4 tablespoons of oyster sauce, 2/3 tablespoons of soy sauce, and 3.5 teaspoons of tapioca starch, and then I'll mix that all together. Once I'm done frying those onions, I'll fish them out and put them together with the pork. I'll add 2 tablespoons of flour to the oil and mix it until it's all dissolved. Then I'll add the gravy mixture, turn the heat on and cook it until it becomes a thick roux-like gravy. I'll take this roux and mix it together with the pork and onions to complete the filling. Everything is cooked at this point, so I gave it a taste and I thought it could be a bit sweeter. So I added 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce. Then I put the bowl into the fridge to cool down, and once it's completely cooled, it'll be ready to use. Now that the dough has doubled in size, I'll deflate it and put it onto a clean work surface. I'll dust it with a bit of flour so that it doesn't stick, and I'll divide it into 2 logs. then divide each log into 6 sections for a total of 12 pieces. Rolling the pieces into the balls can be a bit tricky. I use my palms to apply a bit of pressure while curling my thumbs and fingers and making circular motions. It takes a little bit of practice, but honestly just do whatever works for you. Then I'll cover them with plastic wrap and let them sit for 10 minutes. At this point, the filling should be cool and the buns are ready to assemble. I made sure I have 2 baking trays lined with parchment paper ready, and I start to roll out each of the balls with a rolling pin and spoon on some filling. In these early ones, I added a bit too much filling, and then the next ones I overcompensated by stretching the dough too thin. You'll see what I mean in a bit. I think the right amount of filling is 1 tablespoon, and the dough should be about 7 to 8 centimeters in diameter, or like 3 inches. After trying my best to close the dough around the filling, I pinch and twist the seal, then place the bun seal side down. With all of those buns finished, I put 6 to a tray and cover with plastic wrap for a final proof. This can take anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes, but the size should be really close to the final size, which is after it's done baking. You'll be able to tell if it's finished proofing, 1, based on the size, and 2, if you poke the dough with your finger, the dough will barely bounce back and it will leave an indent. I set the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and while waiting for the oven to preheat, I'm gonna egg wash each bun, making sure I get the tops and the sides. Once that's done, I'm going to bake the buns for 10 minutes. With the buns finished, you can see pretty obviously which buns I put too much filling into and where the dough was rolled out too thin. The other ones actually don't look that half bad. You can see a line around some of the buns, and this is made by an uneven egg wash, so that was one of the mistakes that I made. So we can do another thing to give it a really nice glossy sheen. We're gonna brush on a sugar glaze, which is 2 teaspoons of sugar and 2 teaspoons of hot water. And we are finished. So now let's open one up. Again, I think that the amount of filling wasn't that bad, but the thickness of the dough wasn't right because that top layer is so thin. Taste-wise, it actually tastes pretty close, even though we didn't use a traditional method of making the barbecue pork. A key ingredient here is that Chinese 5-spice powder. More specifically, it's the star anise that gives it a bit of a licorice flavor that you get with a lot of the char siu baos. The dough is mildly sweet and super soft and fluffy. So there you go. A whole day's worth of cooking, taking this hunk of meat and turning it into a bunch of different dishes. I feel like the first 2 dishes were pretty straightforward, but I did learn quite a few things from the pork buns. The first is pretty obvious, which is not to overstuff the buns. This makes things so much more troublesome. Like, the amount of work that I had to do to fix the overstuffed buns was very, very frustrating. Second is going to be more from an aesthetic point, which is to ensure to coat the entire surface with the egg wash. You can see here that I'm brushing the majority of the upper surface, but I'm not actually going underneath around the sides. I'll have to remember that for next time. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.